History remembers Rome as a land of emperors and gladiators, of senators and soldiers. But what about the women who stood in the shadows, quietly shaping the fate of an empire? Picture this, a society where women had no vote, no political power, and were expected to obey without question. Yet, hidden within the marble halls and bustling streets of ancient Rome, a different story unfolds. A story of defiance, cunning, and breathtaking courage. These women didn't just break the rules, they shattered them, risking everything to challenge the most powerful men of their time. Some poisoned emperors in plain sight, others led revolts that shook the foundations of the empire, and a few even turned their own suffering into weapons, rewriting history with acts of rebellion so bold they still echo centuries later. Why does their defiance matter today? Because rebellion isn't just about swords and battles. It's about the quiet moments when someone refuses to accept the world as it is. These Roman women didn't have armies or titles, but they had something far more powerful: unshakable resolve. They used wit, influence, and sometimes sheer audacity to carve their names into history. Think of the noblewoman who smuggled messages to overthrow a tyrant, or the enslaved woman who sparked a revolt that brought Rome to its knees. Their stories aren't just footnotes, they're proof that courage can flourish even in the most oppressive corners of history. So how did they do it? How did women with no legal power manage to outmaneuver emperors and generals? The answers lie in their ingenuity, their networks, and their refusal to be silenced. Over the next 23 astonishing stories, we'll uncover the secrets behind their rebellions, from whispered conspiracies in the imperial palace to bold public acts that left Rome speechless. This isn't just a journey through history, it's a testament to the enduring power of defiance, because when the world tells you to stay silent, sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to speak. Ready to meet the women who dared to defy an empire? Let's begin. Agrippina the Younger didn't just play the game of power, she rewrote the rules. As the sister of one emperor, wife of another, and mother to the infamous Nero, she moved through Rome's corridors of influence like a shadow, always plotting, always calculating. But her most daring act wasn't just securing her son's place on the throne. It was the cold precision with which she removed anyone standing in her way, including her own husband, Emperor Claudius. Imagine the scene: a lavish imperial banquet, dishes piled high with delicacies, and among them, a plate of harmless-looking mushrooms laced with poison. Claudius ate, fell ill, and Agrippina ensured his suffering ended with a helping hand. A feather dipped in poison slipped down his throat under the guise of easing his nausea. It was a murder so brazen, so audacious, that even Rome's jaded elite were stunned. Was Agrippina a monster or a master strategist? The answer depends on who you ask. To her critics, she was the embodiment of ruthless ambition, a woman who sacrificed morality for power. But others argue she was simply surviving in a world where women who didn't act first often ended up dead. After all, this was an era where emperors purged their own families to eliminate threats. Agrippina's crime wasn't her ambition, it was her refusal to be a passive pawn. She understood that in Rome, power wasn't given, it was taken, and take it she did, manipulating Claudius into adopting Nero, sidelining his own son Britannicus, and weaving a web of alliances that made her the most feared woman in the empire. Yet her greatest strength became her downfall. Nero, the son she fought so hard to elevate, eventually turned on her, ordering her assassination in a grim twist of fate. But Agrippina's legacy endures not just as a cautionary tale, but as proof that even in a world designed to silence them, Roman women could bend history to their will. Her story isn't just about poison and betrayal. It's about the lengths a woman would go to protect her future in a society that offered her no safe path. And with that, we turn to another rebel, one who didn't work in shadows but struck in broad daylight, the gladiator's wife who rallied an army. The Vestal Virgins were meant to be Rome's holiest women, guardians of the sacred flame, living symbols of purity whose very existence was said to guarantee the empire's survival. Sworn to 30 years of chastity, they moved through the city like untouchable spirits, revered and feared in equal measure. But behind the pristine white robes and solemn rituals, some of these women harbored a dangerous secret: defiance. When the Vestal Cornelia was accused of breaking her vows, the scandal tore through Rome like wildfire. The punishment was horrifying: buried alive in an underground chamber, a slow death meant to appease the gods without spilling her sacred blood. Yet even as the dirt closed over her, Cornelia's story didn't end in silence. Her fate became a rallying cry, proof that not even divine law could crush the will of women determined to resist. Why did Rome react with such brutality? Because the Vestals weren't just priestesses, they were the empire's spiritual backbone. Their chastity was thought to shield Rome from disaster, their obedience a mirror of the state's order. When a Vestal rebelled, she didn't just break a vow, she threatened the very contract between mortals and gods. That's why the punishment was so theatrical, so cruel. It wasn't just about Cornelia, it was a warning to every woman who dared imagine a life beyond the roles Rome assigned them. But here's the twist: the harsher the punishment, the more audacious the resistance became. Other Vestals followed, risking everything for love, for freedom, or simply for the chance to choose. Some smuggled lovers into their chambers under the noses of watchful priests. Others used their influence to sway political battles, turning their sacred platforms into stages for rebellion. The true power of their defiance lay in its symbolism. These women had been handpicked as girls, taken from their families, and told their bodies were no longer their own. Yet in the heart of Rome's most sacred institution, they reclaimed agency in the most subversive ways imaginable. Their rebellions were quiet, intimate, and devastating because they proved that even the most controlled women could never be fully tamed. Rome's elites might have buried Cornelia, but they couldn't bury the truth. That fear of women's autonomy lurked beneath every law, every ritual, every punishment. And that fear would keep resurfacing generation after generation, as long as women refused to play the parts written for them. Now, let's turn to a rebellion that burned far brighter and far more publicly. If the Vestals defied Rome in whispers, our next rebel shouted her challenge from the rooftops, armed with nothing but a gladiator's sword and a thirst for justice. Fulvia didn't wait for history's permission, she seized it. While Roman women were expected to weave wool and raise children, this noblewoman picked up a sword and marched legions into battle, becoming the first and only woman to command Rome's armies in open warfare. When her husband Mark Antony was away chasing power in the east, Fulvia didn't retreat to the domestic shadows. Instead, she rallied his veterans, fortified cities, and waged the brutal Perusine War against Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. Picture the scene: a woman in flowing stola standing before battle-hardened soldiers, issuing orders that would decide the fate of empires. Rome had never seen anything like it. Why did Fulvia take up arms? Some historians dismiss her as a pawn in Antony's schemes, but the truth is far more fascinating. This was personal. Octavian had betrayed her family, seizing lands and humiliating her allies. Fulvia didn't just defend her husband's interests, she fought for her own survival, in a world where widows and divorced women were easy prey for powerful men. Her tactics were ruthless. She cut off supply lines, outmaneuvered Octavian's generals, and even minted coins bearing her name, a brazen declaration that she was no mere consort but a leader in her own right. For months, she held Italy hostage, forcing Rome to confront an unthinkable reality. A woman could wage war as skillfully as any man. The backlash was inevitable. Roman writers, scandalized by her defiance, painted her as a bloodthirsty shrew. The poet Martial sneered that she ordered deaths with her distaff still in hand, mocking the idea of a woman dictating battles. But Fulvia's real crime wasn't cruelty, it was competence. She proved that military strategy wasn't some innate male gift, but a skill anyone could master. When her forces finally fell to Octavian's siege at Perusia, the victors made sure her surrender was especially humiliating, parading her through the streets to reinforce the lesson. Rome would not tolerate women who crossed this line. Yet Fulvia's legacy refused to fade. Long after her death, whispers of her rebellion lingered, a ghost haunting Rome's rigid gender norms. She'd shown that women could lead armies, outthink emperors, and rewrite the rules if they dared. And while Rome tried to bury her story as a cautionary tale, it survived as something far more dangerous: inspiration. Because every time a woman picked up a pen, a purse, or a protest sign in centuries to come, Fulvia's shadow walked beside her, a reminder that the walls of tradition were never as high as they seemed. Now let's turn to a different kind of rebellion, one fought not with swords but with silk and poison, as we meet the imperial concubine who turned her gilded cage into a weapon. Hortensia didn't need a sword to strike at the heart of Rome's power. Her words were weapon enough. Picture the scene, the Senate floor packed with the empire's most powerful men, all debating how to fund yet another war. Their solution, a brutal tax targeting Rome's wealthiest women, stripping them of gold and property while their husbands and fathers faced no such burden. It was a calculated move, banking on silence, because what woman would dare challenge the Senate? Hortensia did. With the poise of her legendary orator father and the fury of someone who'd had enough, she stepped into that male-dominated space and delivered a speech so scorching, it ripped through Rome's hypocrisy like lightning. What made her defiance so dangerous? She didn't just protest the tax, she exposed the lie at the core of Rome's so-called justice. Why should we pay for wars we have no voice in? She demanded, if you deny us the right to rule, to fight, even to speak in your halls, how can you then demand our treasure? Every word was a mirror held up to the Senate, forcing them to confront their own corruption. And here's the astonishing part, it worked. The senators, shamed by her logic and terrified of the unrest her words might spark among Rome's women, repealed the tax on the spot. Hortensia had achieved the impossible not with force but with flawless rhetoric. But her victory wasn't just about money, it was about precedent. For the first time in recorded history, a woman's speech had altered the laws of a superpower. Think about the sheer audacity of that moment. A society where women couldn't vote, own property independently, or appear in court without a male guardian, yet one voice perfectly aimed toppled an entire policy. The senators likely hoped history would forget Hortensia's triumph, but the opposite happened. Writers like Appian preserved her words, ensuring future generations would know, power isn't just taken by the sword. Sometimes it's claimed by the sheer, unanswerable force of truth, and that truth echoed far beyond Rome. Centuries later, when suffragettes marched for the vote or activists demanded equal pay, they stood on Hortensia's shoulders. She proved that oppression thrives on silence, and the moment someone breaks it, the game changes. Her rebellion wasn't just a tax protest, it was a blueprint. Because when you've been told your voice doesn't matter, speaking up isn't just an act of courage, it's a revolution. Now, let's turn to a rebellion that played out not in the Senate but in the streets, where an enslaved woman's defiance ignited a fire Rome couldn't extinguish. Boudica was never meant to be Rome's nightmare. A queen of the Iceni tribe in Britannia, she might have lived peacefully under Roman rule until the empire showed its true face. After her husband, King Prasutagus, died, leaving his kingdom jointly to their daughters and Emperor Nero, Roman officials descended like vultures. They flogged Boudica publicly, assaulted her daughters, and seized her lands as if the Iceni were mere property. But in that moment of unspeakable cruelty, Rome made a fatal miscalculation. They forgot what happens when you push a mother past breaking point. What followed wasn't just a revolt, it was an inferno. Boudica united fractured Celtic tribes under one purpose: vengeance. Picture 100,000 warriors, their faces painted for war, following a woman in a chariot as she thundered toward Roman settlements. Londinium, Verulamium, Camulogenum, these bustling centers of Roman power burned to the ground, their streets choked with ash and the echoes of Boudica's war cry. The governor's forces were caught utterly unprepared. How could they anticipate an army led by a woman, let alone one with nothing left to lose? But Boudica's rebellion wasn't just about rage, it was about justice. She didn't just attack soldiers, she targeted symbols of Roman oppression: tax records, slave markets, the grand villas where elites lounged while Britain suffered. Every flame she lit was a message. Rome's might was an illusion if the people refused to fear it. For a few glorious months it worked. The mighty Ninth Legion was annihilated. Survivors fled to Gaul, whispering that Britannia was lost. Why did Rome ultimately prevail? Superior tactics, yes, but also the brutal reality of imperial resources. When Governor Suetonius regrouped, he exploited Celtic battle fervor, luring Boudica's forces into a narrow field where Roman discipline trumped sheer numbers. The queen's final stand became legend. Some say she took poison rather than face capture. Others claim she fell in battle, but her real victory outlasted defeat. The rebellion forced Rome to rethink its governance of Britannia, easing taxes and moderating its brutality. Even Tacitus, no friend to rebels, admitted Boudica had been provoked beyond endurance. Her legacy whispers an uncomfortable truth. Oppression thrives on the assumption that the oppressed will endure it. But when a woman like Boudica rises, when maternal love transforms into unquenchable fury, empires tremble. She wasn't just a queen or a warrior. She was living proof that no system is invincible if enough people stop fearing it. And that's why her fire still burns centuries later in every fight against tyranny. Now let's turn from the battlefield to the bedroom, where another woman wielded a very different kind of power, one that could topple emperors with a whisper. Sulpicia's words burned brighter than any torch in Rome's literary halls, and that was her crime. While elite women were praised for silent virtue, this aristocratic poet did the unthinkable. She wrote openly about desire, jealousy, and the raw thrill of forbidden love. Picture the scandal as her verses circulated among Rome's elite, each line a defiant crack in the facade of female modesty. "Let me be called unseemly rather than invisible," she declared, tossing aside the pretense of chastity expected of women in her class. In just 6 surviving poems, Sulpicia did what no Roman woman before her dared. She made her private yearnings public art, ensuring her voice would outlast marble statues and imperial edicts. What made her poetry so revolutionary? It wasn't just the subject matter, it was the ownership. When male poets wrote about lovers, they hid behind mythological allegories or fictional mistresses. Sulpicia named names, chronicling her affair with a man called Cerinthus with startling intimacy. She wrote of sneaking away to meet him, of feverish anticipation, even of petty arguments. the messy, human details Rome's literary establishment deemed unfit for female expression. Her work stripped away the polished masks of Roman love poetry, replacing them with something far more dangerous: authenticity. The miracle isn't that she wrote these poems, it's that they survived. Ancient scribes preserved her work not to celebrate her, but as a curiosity, a cautionary example of female audacity. Yet over centuries, those same dismissive copies became her revenge. While Rome crumbled, Sulpicia's voice endured, whispering to Renaissance scholars and modern readers alike that women's desires were never meant to be secrets. Her rebellion was quiet but seismic. She proved that ink could be as subversive as a sword when wielded by someone told she had no right to hold the pen. Today, her legacy resonates in every diary entry, every love letter, every confessional poem written by women refusing to apologize for their inner lives. Sulpicia didn't just break literary rules, she exposed them as illusions, revealing that the most personal stories could also be the most politically potent. Because when a woman declares, "I want," in a world that tells her to stay silent, those two words become a revolution. Now we turn from the page to the streets, where another woman's defiance took a far more public stage, not with verses, but with the thunder of chariot wheels and the roar of a crowd demanding justice. They called them the Nameless, those women who marched with Spartacus, their shackles shattered, their hands gripping whatever weapons they could find. History barely whispers their stories, but make no mistake, the servile wars weren't just a revolt of enslaved men. Women stood shoulder to shoulder in those ranks, turning the brutal machinery of slavery against their oppressors. Picture the scene, a moonlit camp in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, where thousands of escaped slaves plotted their next move. Among them, women who'd endured unspeakable cruelty, forced labor, violence, the theft of their children, now sharpening blades, tending wounds, and whispering strategies. They weren't just supporting the rebellion, they were its backbone. Why does this matter? Because Rome's entire economy rested on the lie that enslaved people were passive, broken by their chains. The sight of women, those expected to be meek, to suffer silently fighting like furies, shattered that illusion. Ancient historians like Plutarch downplayed their role, focusing on Spartacus as the sole hero. But fragments of truth survive. Some women disguised themselves as men to infiltrate Roman garrisons. Others led foraging parties, keeping the rebel army fed during its daring 2-year campaign. And when the final battle came at the Silarus River, they stood in the front lines, knowing surrender meant crucifixion or worse. Their defiance wasn't just about breaking chains, it was about rewriting the narrative. Enslaved women in Rome faced a special horror. Their bodies were treated as commodities, producing more slaves for the market. By taking up arms, they reclaimed autonomy in the most visceral way possible. Every torch they lit in a Roman villa, every guard they overpowered, screamed one truth: they were not property, they were people. The revolt's failure was inevitable. Rome's military might was too vast, but its legacy was indelible. The Senate passed draconian laws to prevent another uprising, terrified of what might happen if enslaved women ever united again. And though their names are lost, their spirit isn't. Centuries later, when abolitionists rallied against slavery, when Harriet Tubman led the Underground Railroad, that same fire burned. Because the fight for freedom doesn't begin with a manifesto or a treaty. It starts the moment someone looks at their chains and says, "No more." Now we turn from the battlefield to the Senate floor, where another woman wielded a weapon far subtler than a sword: the power of law. Livia drifted through the halls of power like smoke, present everywhere yet impossible to grasp. Officially, she was just the wife of Emperor Augustus, the model Roman matron weaving wool and hosting dignified dinners. Unofficially, she became the empire's most skilled architect of shadows, bending the fate of Rome with a whisper and a well-timed feast. Ancient historians like Tacitus painted her as a master poisoner, alleging she eliminated every rival standing between her son Tiberius and the throne. Whether the rumors were true matters less than what they reveal. Rome's terror at the idea of a woman pulling the strings of empire without ever sitting on the throne herself. Consider the sheer audacity of her influence. In a society where women couldn't even enter the Senate chamber, Livia held private audiences with ambassadors, advised generals, and curated Augustus's public image with the precision of a modern spin doctor. When her husband declared moral reforms to restore Rome's traditional values, it was Livia who quietly exempted her own circle from scrutiny, proving that even the most rigid laws bent around backstage power. And when Augustus's grandson's potential heirs mysteriously died young, all fingers pointed to her. The historian Cassius Dio claimed she smeared poison on figs in the imperial garden, a death so mundane it could be brushed off as tragic illness. But here's the twist: Livia's real weapon wasn't poison, it was perception. She cultivated an image of maternal piety while methodically sidelining threats. When Augustus adopted Tiberius as his successor, it wasn't just politics, it was Livia's lifelong gambit paying off. Even her infamous reputation for murder might have been a calculated trade. Better to be feared as a schemer than dismissed as irrelevant. After all, Rome's elite tolerated her influence precisely because she played the game within the system, wrapping her ambition in the respectable cloak of wifely duty. The brilliance of her rule, because it was rule, no matter what title she lacked, lay in its invisibility. While later empresses like Agrippina seized power overtly and paid the price, Livia built hers to last. When Augustus died, she didn't just survive the transition. She became Mater Patriae, Mother of the Nation, a living symbol of continuity. Tiberius, resentful of her control, famously withdrew from Rome, but he never dared move against her. Even in death she won, deified by her grandson Claudius, her cult outliving the Julio-Claudian dynasty itself. What makes Livia's story so compelling isn't the blood on her hands, it's the blueprint she left. She proved that in a system designed to erase women from history, the quietest voices could echo the loudest. While Rome's chroniclers shuddered at her unnatural influence, they couldn't ignore a simple truth. Behind every great emperor, there was often a greater woman rewriting the rules without breaking them, at least not where anyone could prove it. Perpetua's prison diary survives as one of history's most extraordinary acts of defiance, not just against Rome, but against every expectation placed on a woman of her time. 22 years old, noble-born, a new mother, she could have walked free any moment by simply scattering incense on a pagan altar. Instead, she chose the arena. Her own words, scribbled in darkness while awaiting execution, reveal a mind utterly unbroken. When my father begged me to renounce Christ, I pointed to a water jug and asked, "Can you call this vessel by any other name?" When he said no, I replied, "Neither can I call myself anything but a Christian." The metaphor was devastating in its simplicity. She wasn't just refusing ritual, she was asserting that her identity couldn't be dictated by emperors or even family. Then there was Felicity, Perpetua's enslaved companion, 8 months pregnant when arrested. Roman law forbade executing expecting mothers, so guards taunted her. "How will you face the beasts when you can't even bear your chains?" Her response: praying for early labor, then giving birth in prison just days before their scheduled martyrdom. When a guard mocked her screams during childbirth, she fired back, "Now I suffer alone. But soon another will suffer for me, and I for him." The chilling beauty of that exchange captures the heart of their rebellion. These women weren't just dying for faith, They were reclaiming agency over their bodies and pain in a society that treated both as property. March 7th, 203, the amphitheater in Carthage roared as Perpetua, Felicity, and their companions were led out. Roman officials, unsettled by the crowd's growing sympathy, rushed the spectacle, sending a rabid heifer to trample the women instead of gladiators, hoping to humiliate them with a feminine death. The plan backfired. Perpetua, tossed by the beast, calmly straightened her torn tunic and pinned up her hair, as if preparing for prayer rather than slaughter. When the novice gladiator tasked with killing her trembled, she guided his sword to her own throat. Every detail of that day, preserved by eyewitnesses, was a calculated subversion. In a culture where women's deaths were meant to be private, messy affairs, they turned execution into theater, and their final act upstaged the empire's entire script. Why does this matter beyond religious history? Because their martyrdom exposed Rome's deepest fear, that the powerless could wield more influence in death than the powerful did in life. Within decades, Carthaginian Christians venerated Perpetua and Felicity as saints. Their story spread like wildfire, inspiring converts from Gaul to Syria. Augustine himself, a century later, still preached about their courage, but the true revolution lay in what they represented: women who refused to let the state define their worth. In an era where female voices were routinely erased, Perpetua's diary survived precisely because Rome couldn't silence it. The empire killed their bodies, but their words outlasted legions. The irony is delicious. Rome executed them to set an example, not realizing they'd become the ultimate counterexample. Every time a medieval mystic cited Perpetua's bravery, every time a Renaissance painter depicted her calm gaze in the arena, every time a modern protester endures prison for conscience sake, they prove that some acts of rebellion can't be buried. Because when authority demands you surrender your soul, sometimes the most radical reply is to hold it up, unbroken, for the world to see. Now we turn from the sands of Carthage to the marble halls of power, where another woman weaponized the last thing Rome expected: laughter. Messalina didn't just break Rome's rules, she set them on fire and danced in the ashes. By day, she played the dutiful empress, standing beside Emperor Claudius in public ceremonies. But by night, she slipped into the shadows of the Suburra, Rome's most notorious red light district, disguised in a blonde wig and the name Lycia. The scandal that would echo through history wasn't just about sex, it was about a woman weaponizing her own notoriety. Ancient historians like Juvenal and Tacitus claim she once challenged a famous prostitute to a 24-hour contest, tallying over 25 encounters to her rival's 12. Whether the numbers were exaggerated hardly matters. The story's power lies in its sheer audacity, an empress treating the bedroom as a battleground, reducing Rome's obsession with female virtue to a farce. But was Messalina truly the nymphomaniac monster history paints, or was she a woman clawing back control in the only way she could? Consider the world she inhabited. Married to Claudius at 15, she'd spent years watching her husband purge political rivals, including her own uncle, while senators praised his wisdom. Meanwhile, aristocratic wives were expected to embody stoic modesty, their worth measured by chastity and childbearing. Messalina's rebellion cut through that hypocrisy like a knife. If Rome reduced women to their bodies, she'd use hers as a weapon, turning imperial morality into a punchline. Her alleged affairs with senators, gladiators, and even the consul-elect weren't just reckless, they were calculated humiliations, proving that the men who judged her were just as complicit. The backlash was inevitable. When Claudius finally ordered her execution for treason, a charge likely fabricated by rivals, the empress reportedly begged for her life in the gardens of Lucullus, offering the emperor their 2 children as bargaining chips. He refused. What makes her story haunting isn't the death itself, but the way Rome rewrote it. Later historians framed her as a cautionary tale of female excess, ignoring the deeper truth. Messalina's real crime wasn't promiscuity, it was refusing to play the silent trophy wife. In a society that demanded women be invisible, she made sure no one could look away. Yet even in infamy, she left a paradox. While Roman writers condemned her, they couldn't stop talking about her. Centuries later, painters like Tiepolo would immortalize her excesses, and modern psychologists would debate whether she was a rebel or a victim. Perhaps both are true. Because the most subversive part of Messalina's legacy isn't the scandal, it's the unanswered question she forces us to confront. When a woman is trapped in a gilded cage, is self-destruction the only form of freedom left? Her life, or the myth of it, whispers a dangerous idea that sometimes the most powerful act isn't surviving the system, but setting it ablaze on your way out. Now we turn from the bedroom to the battlefield, where another woman's defiance took a far deadlier form, not with lovers, but with legions at her back. Hypatia walked the streets of Alexandria like a living paradox, a woman who commanded the respect of emperors and scholars in an era when most women were denied even basic literacy. Her lecture halls drew students from across the Mediterranean, eager to learn geometry, astronomy, and the secrets of the cosmos from the greatest mind of her age. She moved through the male-dominated world of academia with effortless authority, her sharp mind dissecting Plato and Aristotle with the same precision she used to refine astrolabes. But in 5th century Alexandria, knowledge was power, and power was a death sentence for a woman who refused to bow. The tragedy of Hypatia's murder wasn't just its brutality, it was its inevitability. Alexandria simmered with tension between Christians, Jews, and pagans, each faction vying for control. As the city's most prominent intellectual, Hypatia became a target not because she took sides, but precisely because she didn't. She welcomed students of all faiths, judged ideas on their merit, and embodied a truth that terrified zealots. That wisdom transcends dogma. When Bishop Cyril's followers dragged her from her chariot, stripped her naked, and scraped her flesh from her bones with oyster shells, they weren't just killing a philosopher, they were trying to erase the very idea of a woman who thought for herself. Yet the most chilling detail of her martyrdom isn't the violence, it's the aftermath. The mob burned her writings, dismantled her instruments, and scrubbed her name from official records, as if her existence had been a clerical error. For centuries, historians framed her death as a spontaneous riot, ignoring the calculated silence that followed. But whispers persisted. Students preserved fragments of her work in secret. Neoplatonists kept her teachings alive under threat of persecution. Even the Christian chronicler Socrates Scholasticus, no fan of pagans, admitted Hypatia had been murdered for envy rather than justice. What makes Hypatia's legacy so enduring isn't just her brilliance, it's the pattern her death reveals. From medieval witch hunts to modern bans on girls' education, societies have always feared women who wield knowledge as effortlessly as men wield swords. Her story forces us to confront an ugly truth, that intellectual freedom is never guaranteed, especially for those told their minds belong in cages. Every time a schoolgirl opens an astronomy textbook or a woman defends her thesis in a hostile lecture hall, they walk the path Hypatia carved, one oyster shell at a time. Now we turn from the libraries of Alexandria to the slave markets of Rome, where another woman's defiance took a form no one saw coming, not with lectures, but with laughter that cut deeper than any blade. The crowd roared as the two gladiators circled each other, swords glinting under the merciless Roman sun. But this was no ordinary fight because the warriors' locking eyes weren't men. They were women, Amazonia and Achilia, their names etched into history by a rare stone relief from Halicarnassus, stood armored and unflinching, proving that the arena's thirst for blood didn't discriminate. Rome liked to pretend its violence was a masculine spectacle, a theater where men proved their valor, but the existence of women like these, trained, celebrated, and feared, shatters that illusion. They didn't just sneak into the games, they dominated them, turning the sand beneath their feet into a stage for rebellion. Why were female gladiators such a threat? Because they exposed the lie at the heart of Roman gender roles. Strength, courage, brutality, these were supposed to be male virtues, the glue holding the empire together. When women stepped into that space, wielding swords with the same skill as men, it forced Rome to confront an uncomfortable truth: biology didn't dictate destiny. The poet Juvenal sneered at the idea, mocking upper-class women who yearned for the crude arena, as if their ambition was a joke, but the graffiti tells a different story. Scratched into walls from Pompeii to Ostia are tributes to these fighters, names like Nike the Victorious and Hera the Unbroken, proof that the public adored them. Even emperors couldn't resist. Nero famously staged elaborate battles featuring women, and Domitian pitted them against dwarves, twisting the spectacle into something even more grotesque and thrilling. Then came the ban. In the 2nd century, Emperor Septimius Severus outlawed female gladiators, calling their fights an offense to the gods, but the real offense was to Rome's fragile masculinity. These women hadn't just fought, they'd won. They'd stood tall as the crowd chanted their names, collecting prizes and glory that should have belonged to men. The ban wasn't about morality, it was about control. Because when a woman could bleed just as boldly as a man, when she could taste victory and demand applause, it undermined the entire social order. Yet their legacy couldn't be erased. The relief of Amazonia and Achilia survives as a middle finger to history's silence, showing them mid-battle, weapons raised, neither yielding nor afraid. They weren't anomalies. They were part of a tradition that stretched from the Republic to the Empire's twilight, a secret Rome tried to bury. Today, their story resonates in every woman who steps onto a wrestling mat, a boxing ring, or a battlefield, defying those who say combat isn't her place. The sand may have settled, but the footprints remain, and they lead us to our next rebel, a woman who didn't fight with a sword, but with something far more dangerous: the truth. Julia the Elder lived her life like a comet, brilliant, blazing, and doomed to fall. As Emperor Augustus' only biological child, she was raised to embody his moral reforms, those strict laws demanding female chastity and marital fidelity. The irony was crushing. While her father lectured Rome about traditional values, Julia danced through its bedrooms, taking lovers with a freedom that would have been unremarkable for a man of her status. Senators, poets, even Augustus' own allies, her affairs were as numerous as they were reckless. But this wasn't just about passion. Every whispered rendezvous was a thumb pressed to the eye of her father's hypocrisy. The scandal that finally destroyed her wasn't even the worst of her transgressions. It was the one Augustus couldn't ignore. When rumors linked Julia to Mark Antony's son, a political enemy, the emperor snapped. Overnight, Rome's golden princess became its most infamous exile, banished to a barren island with nothing but her mother's ashes for company. No trial, no defense, just the absolute power of a father who'd rather bury his daughter's reputation than admit his laws were hollow. What makes Julia's punishment so revealing isn't its severity, it's its inconsistency. Augustus himself had multiple affairs, as did nearly every elite man in Rome. Poets like Ovid wrote manuals on seduction without consequence, but when Julia indulged the same appetites, she wasn't just breaking rules, she was exposing the lie behind them. Rome's double standard wasn't about morality, it was about control. A man's affairs reinforced his power. A woman's threatened the bloodline, the inheritance, the carefully constructed facade of dynasty. Yet Julia's exile backfired spectacularly. Instead of fading into obscurity, she became a symbol. The people of Rome, weary of Augustus' puritanical grip, whispered her name in taverns and scribbled it on walls. Even in isolation, her defiance haunted him. Years later, when a visitor asked if Julia might be forgiven, Augustus replied with chilling finality, "May the gods give you worse daughters than mine." The bitterness in those words betrayed his real fear, not that Julia had sinned, but that she'd won. By living unapologetically, she'd proven that no law could cage a woman's spirit. Her legacy lingers in every era that polices female desire while winking at male transgressions. Julia's real crime wasn't loving too much, it was refusing to pretend she had anything to be ashamed of. And in a world that still debates who gets to love freely, her exile stands as a stark reminder. When society condemns a woman's choices, it's often not about justice. It's about who holds the keys. Eumatia's name wasn't carved into battle trophies or whispered in Senate intrigues. It was etched into the marble of Pompeii's grandest public buildings. While Rome's elite obsessed over military conquests and political backstabbing, this shrewd businesswoman quietly rewrote the rules of power using a weapon they underestimated: commerce. As the matron of a sprawling brickworks empire and the city's most prolific patron, she didn't just donate money, she built the literal foundations of civic life. The Fuller's Guild Hall, the Temple of Concordia Augusta, even the marketplace's colonnades, all bore her name and her gold. In a world where women couldn't vote or hold office, Eumatia turned economic clout into something far more dangerous: irreplaceability. What made her generosity so subversive? It exposed the hypocrisy of Rome's power structure. The same men who barred women from official roles gladly accepted her funds to beautify their city, then seethed when she demanded influence in return. Her grandest project, the enormous building near Pompeii's Forum, wasn't just a gift, it was a masterstroke dedicated to harmony and piety. Its inscription carefully echoed imperial propaganda, but the message was clear: Eumatia's wealth could shape public space as decisively as any senator's decree. Inside, statues of her family stood alongside emperors, visually equating her lineage with Rome's rulers. The building even housed the Fuller's Guild, giving her leverage over the lucrative textile trade. Every denarius she spent was a silent challenge. If you want my money, you'll respect my voice. The backlash was inevitable. Male rivals mocked her as that merchant's daughter, sneering at her non-aristocratic roots. But Eumatia had the last laugh. When Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii in ash, her buildings were among the last things its citizens saw, enduring monuments to a woman who'd outmaneuvered an entire system. While warlords and politicians crumbled to dust, her economic rebellion survived in stone, proving that influence isn't always seized with a sword. Sometimes it's bought brick by brick. Now let's journey from the quiet power of commerce to the explosive force of faith, where our next rebel didn't build monuments, she tore them down. The Sibyls stood at the crossroads of history, their voices trembling with divine fury as Rome's new Christian tide swept away the old gods. These women weren't just priestesses, they were living bridges to a world the empire was desperate to forget. While emperors like Theodosius ordered temples smashed and pagan rituals banned, the Sibyls kept whispering their prophecies in shadowed groves and secret caves, guarding wisdom that had guided Rome for centuries. Their defiance wasn't just spiritual, it was political. Every chant, every ritual they preserved was a refusal to let Christianity monopolize the sacred. Take the Sibyl of Cumae, her prophecies etched on oak leaves and stored in jars beneath Apollo's temple. Even as Christian mobs toppled statues, pilgrims still risked persecution to seek her counsel. Why? Because Rome's elite might have swapped Jupiter for Jesus, but ordinary people clung to the comfort of familiar rites. The Sibyls understood something the bishops didn't. Faith isn't decreed by edict. It lives in the hands of those who tend its flames. The most astonishing part, some of these women outmaneuvered the church on its own turf. The Sibylline oracles, once pagan texts, were cleverly reframed as pre-Christian prophecies predicting Christ's birth. Suddenly, bishops couldn't destroy them without rejecting their own Messiah's divine foreshadowing. It was a masterstroke preserving ancient knowledge by stitching it into the enemy's scripture. But the real rebellion was quieter. In village after village, pagan grandmothers taught daughters to leave offerings to Diana at the new moon, disguising goddess worship as harmless folk tradition. Midwives still invoked Juno Lucina during childbirth, baptizing old magic in Christian terms. This wasn't just nostalgia, it was resistance by 1,000 tiny acts of remembrance. Rome's conversion wasn't the clean break historians pretend. For generations, women kept the old ways alive in whispers, proving that spiritual power never truly submits. It just finds new cracks to grow through, and when the church later canonized female saints who spoke to God directly, it unwittingly admitted a truth the Sibyls knew all along: the divine has always had a woman's voice. The wicked stepmother wasn't just a fairy tale trope, it was Rome's favorite smear campaign, a weapon wielded by historians and playwrights to tarnish women who dared to navigate the treacherous waters of blended families. Take the infamous case of Livia, Augustus's wife, accused by Tacitus of poisoning his grandsons to secure her son Tiberius's succession. Never mind that the evidence was flimsy at best, the narrative stuck because it tapped into a deep cultural anxiety. Stepmothers in Rome occupied a uniquely precarious position, expected to raise another woman's children as their own, yet perpetually suspected of favoring their biological offspring. They couldn't win. If they disciplined their stepchildren, they were cruel. If they showed affection, they were manipulative. The stereotype became a self-fulfilling prophecy, a way to police women's behavior by ensuring any misstep would confirm society's worst fears. This wasn't just gossip, it was political. Rome's inheritance laws made stepmothers convenient scapegoats in battles over wealth and power. When a wealthy patriarch died suddenly, accusing his widow of poisoning him was an easy way to disinherit her children. The poet Juvenal even joked that knowing the right stepmother could get you off a murder charge, so ingrained was the trope in the public imagination. But beneath the satire lay a darker truth. These stories weren't about justice, they were about control. By painting ambitious women as inherently treacherous, Rome's elite justified stripping them of agency, property, and even their lives. Fast forward 2,000 years, and the archetype still haunts us. From Disney's villainous queens to true crime documentaries obsessing over Black Widow suspects, the shadow of the Roman stepmother lingers. Why does this ancient slander persist? Because it serves the same purpose today as it did then: to pathologize women who refuse to be passive. A stepmother advocating for her child's inheritance is greedy. A widow remarrying is rushing to replace her late husband. The language may have modernized, but the subtext remains. Women who navigate complex family dynamics with assertiveness must be monsters. The real rebellion lies in recognizing the trope for what it is, not a reflection of reality, but a tool to silence dissent. When Roman writers like Tacitus spun tales of murderous stepmothers, they weren't documenting history. They were writing propaganda, reinforcing a status quo that feared women's influence. Today, every time we question the wicked stepmother narrative, whether in courtrooms, fiction, or school pickup lines, we chip away at a lie as old as the Forum stones. Because the most dangerous women aren't the ones who fit the stereotype. They're the ones who refuse to let it define them. Now, let's turn from the shadows of suspicion to the blinding light of the arena, where another woman's defiance took the most public stage imaginable, not with poison, but with a sword and the unbreakable will to survive. The tomb of Eurysaces stands like a defiant whisper against Rome's monumental silence, a baker's tribute to his wife Atischa, her hands forever frozen in stone measuring grain. In a city obsessed with military triumphs and imperial vanity, this humble monument does something astonishing. It celebrates a woman's labor as worthy of immortality. While senators built tombs adorned with battle scenes and poets penned odes to male virtue, Eurysaces chose to carve Atischa's daily act of kneading dough into history. The message is as radical as it is tender. Her work mattered. Consider the sheer rarity of this gesture. Roman women's contributions, especially in trades, were systematically erased. The frescoes that survive show them as muses, mothers, or ornaments, never as artisans shaping the economy. Yet Atischa's depiction tells a different story. The grain measure in her hands isn't just a domestic tool, it's a symbol of partnership. Eurysaces, himself a freedman who rose from slavery to become Rome's most famous baker, knew their fortune was built on shared toil. His tomb's cylindrical shapes mimic grain silos, its friezes bustling with bakers, a visual ode to the craft that lifted them both from obscurity. In honoring Atischa's role, he honored every woman whose labor fed empires without ever appearing in their ledgers. Why does this tomb unsettle historians? Because it exposes the lie behind Rome's official narratives. The same culture that praised women for spinning wool at home turned a blind eye to those who ran businesses, managed workshops, or like Atischa, kept the books for their husbands' trades. Her measuring cup is a quiet rebellion, proof that women's economic power was everywhere, even if the law pretended otherwise. The poet Juvenal mocked such working wives as busybodies, but Eurysaces' tribute suggests a different truth. Rome's bread was buttered by invisible hands. The real magic of this monument lies in its intimacy. Unlike the cold grandeur of imperial mausoleums, this is a love letter in stone. Eurysaces could have depicted Atischa veiled as a dutiful matron, but he chose to show her mid-task, sleeves rolled up, immersed in the work that bound their lives together. In doing so, he gifted us something far more precious than a royal epitaph, a snapshot of real life, where partnership outweighed pageantry. 2,000 years later, their tomb still stands near Rome's Porta Maggiore, a testament to the quiet revolutions that happen when someone refuses to let the world forget. The story of Pope Joan is history's most tantalizing ecclesiastical ghost. A woman who supposedly ascended the throne of St. Peter in the 9th century, her true identity hidden beneath papal robes until the ultimate betrayal of her own body. According to medieval chroniclers, she was an English scholar of staggering intellect who disguised herself as a man to study theology, rising through the church's ranks with such brilliance that she was elected pope. For 2 years, she allegedly ruled Christendom as John Anglicus until a fateful procession through Rome when labor pains racked her body mid-ceremony, exposing the impossible truth. The legend varies on her fate. Some say she died in childbirth on the spot. Others claim an angry mob dragged her through the streets. But the tale's grip on the medieval imagination reveals something far more fascinating than its veracity. The sheer terror it sparked in a society that couldn't conceive of female spiritual authority. Why did this myth persist for centuries? Because it touched every raw nerve in medieval Europe's body politic. The church had spent generations barring women from altars, citing St. Paul's edict that they remain silent. Joan's story flipped that logic on its head, suggesting holiness wasn't inherent to male bodies but could be performed, and performed better by a woman in disguise. The details medieval writers fixated on betray their anxieties. Joan's downfall came not from theological error but from biology. Her intellect was never in question. It was her womb that rendered her unfit. Even the purported location of her exposure, a narrow street near the Colosseum, later dubbed the Vicus Papissa, Pope Joan's Alley, became a site of morbid pilgrimage, a cautionary landmark for those who dared blur God's ordained roles. But here's the delicious irony: the Church's frantic denials only fed the legend. 14th century chronicler Martin of Opava wove Joan into his official papal histories, while reformers like John Hus cited her as proof of Rome's corruption. By the Renaissance, even Catholic scholars debated her existence, with some suggesting records were purged to hide the scandal. The Vatican's later insistence that all popes undergo a ritual inspection of their masculinity, the so-called chair of proof, only deepened suspicions. Whether fact or fable, Joan's specter forced the Church to confront its own contradictions. If women were spiritually inferior, why did the threat of one outperforming men unsettle them so profoundly? The most compelling evidence against Joan's existence isn't the lack of contemporary records, it's the story's uncanny resemblance to ancient tropes. From the Greek goddess Athena, born of Zeus's head, to the transvestite saints of early Christianity, societies have long fantasized about women transcending biology to wield male power. Yet the legend's endurance speaks to a deeper truth. Forbidden knowledge always finds cracks in the edifice. Every time a medieval abbess wielded influence behind the scenes, or a mystic like Hildegard of Bingen claimed direct divine revelation, Joan's ghost nodded in approval. Her story endures not because it happened, but because it could have, and that possibility was enough to haunt an entire institution. Today, Pope Joan lingers in the space between history and parable, a reminder that the loudest myths often grow from the quietest fears. When modern women don clerical collars or demand ordination, they walk the same tightrope Joan supposedly did. Proving competence shouldn't require disguise, but sometimes the costume is the only way the world will listen. The real scandal isn't whether a woman once sat on the papal throne, it's how desperately we still cling to the idea that she couldn't have. Rome's witch hunts didn't need broomsticks or cauldrons, just a woman who stepped out of line. Long before the medieval craze for burning witches, Roman women faced their own deadly accusations of poisoning and dark magic. The charges always followed the same sinister pattern. A prominent man falls ill, a rival suffers misfortune, and suddenly fingers point to the nearest woman who dared to be too independent, too knowledgeable, or simply too inconvenient. Take the case of Cornelia, a Vestal virgin accused of poisoning her husband in the 1st century. Never mind that she'd been handpicked as a child for her piety. When political winds shifted, her knowledge of herbs became evidence of witchcraft, her independence recast as malevolence. Her execution wasn't justice, it was a reminder that any woman could be next. What made these accusations so effective was their sheer flexibility, a midwife's skill with medicinal plants. Clearly sorcery, a widow inheriting her husband's estate, suspiciously convenient. Even something as mundane as a servant girl muttering to herself could be twisted into evidence of curses. The historian Livy recounts how in 186 B.C., hundreds of women were rounded up and executed for allegedly poisoning their husbands, a purge that conveniently coincided with a grain shortage and rising unrest among Rome's poor. The real crime wasn't witchcraft, it was being female in a system that needed scapegoats. But here's what history often misses: these persecutions weren't just about eliminating threats. they were about manufacturing them. By painting women as inherently dangerous, Rome's elite justified controlling every aspect of their lives. The laws against love potions and abortifacients weren't protecting society. They were ensuring women couldn't wield power over reproduction or relationships. When Apuleius stood trial for witchcraft in the 2nd century, his defense hinged on proving his accuser, a woman, was the real sorceress. The subtext was clear: women's knowledge itself was suspect, their autonomy a gateway to chaos. The legacy of Rome's witch hunts echoes in every modern moral panic that targets women first. From medieval Europe's burning times to 20th century hysterectomies performed on hysterical women, the playbook remains disturbingly familiar. Rome's real witches weren't the ones mixing potions, they were the women who refused to stay in their assigned lanes, and the system that couldn't tolerate their freedom. Their stories warn us: when a society fears female power, the first thing it burns is the truth. Faustina the Younger's hair wasn't just a style, it was a stratagem. As wife of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, she stood at the pinnacle of Roman society, where every curl and braid carried unspoken weight. While historians praised her husband's philosophical musings, they often overlooked Faustina's most ingenious rebellion: her towering honey-blonde wigs, each more elaborate than the last. These weren't mere vanity projects. In a world where sumptuary laws dictated everything from jewelry to shoe color, hair became one of the few canvases where elite women could paint their defiance in broad, golden strokes. Consider the physics of these creations. Some styles reached nearly a foot tall, woven with imported German hair, pearls, and even miniature diadems. A silent proclamation that Faustina's influence couldn't be contained by traditional modesty standards. When conservative senators grumbled that such excesses violated Rome's austere ideals, she simply added more volume. The message was clear: if men could flaunt power through military triumphs and senatorial decrees, women would do so through the architecture of their own bodies. But Faustina's real genius lay in her sourcing. By popularizing wigs made from captured Germanic hair, a luxury commodity taken from barbarian prisoners, she turned beauty routines into political theater. Every time she appeared in public, her coiffure literally embodied Rome's conquests, reframing military victories as feminine adornment. It was a masterclass in subversion. What appeared to be frivolous fashion actually showcased imperial might through a distinctly female lens. The backlash only proved her point. When satirists like Juvenal mocked matrons for their towering horrors of hair, they revealed the real anxiety: that these styles made women impossible to ignore. A senator could command a room with his voice. A woman needed 3 pounds of braids and a small fortune in hairpins to achieve the same effect. Even in death, Faustina's legacy endured. Her iconic melon hairstyle, tight coils resembling a cantaloupe's ridges, became the standard for imperial women for generations, ensuring that long after her passing, every new empress would literally wear her rebellion on her head. What makes these hairstyles revolutionary isn't their extravagance, but their duality. They conformed enough to avoid outright condemnation while pushing boundaries just far enough to matter. In a society that measured women's worth by their unobtrusiveness, Faustina and her peers built monuments atop their own scalps, silent, glittering protests that said, "I take up space." Today, when we see modern celebrities using bold hairstyles as political statements, they're walking a path Faustina paved 2,000 years ago. Because sometimes the most powerful revolutions aren't fought with swords, but with scissors, pins, and the audacity to be seen. The whip couldn't steal their songs, the auction block couldn't erase their stories. Enslaved women in Rome waged a rebellion so quiet, so relentless, that historians almost missed it, but their resistance was there, woven into the fabric of everyday life. Picture a woman grinding grain in a wealthy household, her hands moving steadily as she hums a lullaby from her homeland. To her enslaver, it's just a tune. To her, it's an act of defiance, a way to teach her child a language their master forbids. These women didn't just endure oppression, they subverted it, turning the very tools of their bondage into weapons of survival. Take something as simple as cooking. A meal prepared by an enslaved woman might include spices from her homeland, flavors smuggled in memory and passed down like contraband. Every dish seasoned with cumin or coriander was a silent reclaiming of identity, a reminder that her culture couldn't be scraped off like chains. Even the act of slowing her work, breaking a loom's thread, accidentally, spilling wine just enough to waste it became a form of sabotage. These weren't grand gestures, but they were calculated ones, chipping away at the system's efficiency in ways too small to punish but too constant to ignore. Then there were the healers, women whose knowledge of herbs and remedies made them indispensable and dangerous. A midwife might secretly use contraceptives to spare another woman the horror of bearing a child into slavery. A nurse could administer just enough soothing tonic to ease a fellow enslaved person's pain while withholding its full effect from a cruel master. Their expertise gave them power, however fleeting, over life and death in a world that treated them as property. But the most enduring rebellion was cultural preservation. In the dead of night, women gathered to tell stories of their ancestors, shaping myths into maps for survival. They braided their children's hair in patterns that carried meaning, stitched hidden symbols into clothing, and turned festivals like Saturnalia, when roles were briefly reversed into moments of coded mockery. These acts weren't just comfort, they were resistance by memory, ensuring that even if their bodies were bound, their spirits never were. Rome's archives barely whisper their names, but their legacy shouts. Every folk remedy still used today, every lullaby hummed in a forgotten tongue, every recipe that survived centuries, these are their victories. Their rebellion wasn't recorded in Senate decrees or carved into marble, but it outlasted both. Because the quietest acts of defiance often leave the deepest echoes, Cornelia stood before the visiting noblewoman with a quiet defiance that unsettled Rome's elite. When the guest proudly displayed her jeweled treasures, expecting admiration, Cornelia simply gestured to her two sons playing nearby. "These are my gems," she said, a moment so iconic that artists would immortalize it for centuries. But this wasn't just maternal pride, it was political theater. By framing Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus as her greatest legacy, Cornelia subtly reminded Rome that behind every revolutionary stood a woman who shaped him. What made Cornelia's influence so extraordinary was its paradox. She embodied every Roman virtue, chaste, dutiful, devoted to her children, yet wielded more power than most senators. After her husband's death, she refused remarriage to the king of Egypt, choosing instead to focus on her son's education. This wasn't just personal choice, it was strategic. Unencumbered by a new husband's agenda, she became the sole architect of the Gracchi brothers' political ideals, schooling them in Greek philosophy and the art of rhetoric. By the time Tiberius proposed his radical land reforms, his arguments bore the unmistakable stamp of Cornelia's teachings, a fact his enemies noted with fury. The backlash revealed Rome's hypocrisy. Senators praised Cornelia as the mother of the Gracchi, while secretly resenting her influence. When Tiberius was murdered by political rivals, they expected her to retreat into mourning silence. Instead, she doubled down, guiding Gaius toward even more sweeping reforms. Her home became a salon for Rome's brightest minds, where discussions of wealth redistribution and citizenship rights unfolded under her watchful eye. The historian Plutarch recounts how she even sent Gaius letters critiquing his speeches not with maternal praise, but with sharp political analysis. Cornelia's genius lay in turning domesticity into a weapon. While Roman women couldn't address the Senate, they could raise the men who would. Her legacy wasn't just in birthing the Gracchi, but in molding them into existential threats to the status quo. After Gaius's death, she retired to a seaside villa, surrounded by scholars who treated her not as a relic, but as a living library of political thought. The bronze statue erected in her honor, the first for a non-mythological Roman woman, captured her holding a scroll, not a spindle. Her story forces us to reconsider what virtuous really meant in Rome. The same system that praised women for self-effacement trembled when one used motherhood as a platform for change. Cornelia proved that the quietest power could be the most dangerous, because while Rome knew how to crush rebels in the Forum, it had no answer for a woman who fought her battles through the minds of her children. 2,000 years later, her lesson still resonates. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to teach. The Sabine women didn't just stand between two armies, they shattered the myth that war is inevitable. Picture the scene: Rome's fledgling kingdom, desperate for wives, had kidnapped Sabine women to populate their city. Years later, those same women faced an impossible choice as their Sabine fathers and brothers marched to rescue them, swords drawn against their Roman husbands. But when the battle lines hardened, the women did the unthinkable. They rushed onto the battlefield, babies in arms, hair unbound, screaming for both sides to stop. Not as victims, not as prizes, but as mediators with nothing left to lose. What makes their intervention so revolutionary isn't just the act itself, but the symbolism. In a world where women were literally fought over like property, they seized agency in the most public way possible. Livy's account paints them as desperate mourners, but read between the lines, this was a calculated strike. By placing themselves and their children squarely in the path of violence, they weaponized their supposed weakness. The men couldn't attack without killing their own daughters, sisters, or the mothers of their heirs. The Sabine women turned their bodies into shields, forcing both sides to confront the human cost of their pride. The legend's enduring power lies in its subversion of expectations. Rome's foundation myths glorify rape and conquest, yet this moment flips the script, making women the architects of peace. Even the details are telling. The women didn't just beg, they invoked sacred bonds, shouting to their fathers that these Romans were now their family too. They reframed the conflict not as a battle over stolen women, but as a betrayal of kinship. And it worked. The Sabines lowered their weapons, the Romans sheathed their swords, and the two peoples merged into one kingdom. But here's what often gets overlooked. The Sabine women didn't just stop a war, they rewrote their own ending. By refusing to be pawns, they became partners. The treaty that followed granted them unprecedented rights, freedom from hard labor, the ability to inherit property, and a say in their children's futures. Their bravery proved that peacemaking wasn't passive, it was a form of power too potent to ignore. Centuries later, when Roman matrons intervened in political crises or brokered truces, they walked in the footsteps of those Sabine women who first showed them how to turn vulnerability into strength. The real lesson of this legend isn't about ancient diplomacy, it's about redefining courage. These women didn't have swords or senatorial influence, but they had something far more disruptive, the moral authority to say enough. In a world still obsessed with conquest, their story whispers a radical idea that the fiercest warriors might be the ones who refuse to let others fight. From poison to poetry, these 23 acts of rebellion shatter the myth that Roman women were mere bystanders in history. They were strategists wielding banquets as battlefields, poets turning parchment into protest, and mothers molding the minds that would shake empires. Their defiance took countless forms: Agrippina's lethal ambition, Hortensia's blistering rhetoric, the enslaved women who whispered lullabies of resistance, but each act shared a common thread, the refusal to accept the world as Rome decreed it should be. What makes their rebellion so timeless isn't just their audacity, but their ingenuity. They had no legal power, no armies, no vote, yet they found cracks in the system and pried them open with whatever tools they had. A poisoned mushroom, a perfectly argued speech, a child raised to question injustice. Their victories weren't always sweeping reforms. Sometimes they were simply survival, or the quiet preservation of dignity in a world determined to erase it. But collectively, they proved that oppression is never absolute. There's always a way to push back, even if the cost is unimaginable. These stories matter today because they expose a truth we still grapple with. Progress isn't a gift bestowed by the powerful. It's wrested from their grip by those told they don't deserve it. Every civil rights march, every courtroom challenge to inequality, every hashtag that amplifies a silenced voice stands on the shoulders of rebels like Cornelia, who turned motherhood into mentorship, or Perpetua, whose prison diary outlived her executioners. History's most pivotal changes rarely begin in palaces or parliaments. They start in the shadows, with someone whispering, "This isn't right," and someone else whispering back, "Then let's fix it." So let these women be more than footnotes. Let them be blueprints. The next time you're told something can't be changed, whether it's an unfair policy, a toxic tradition, or the limits others place on your potential, remember the Vestal who smuggled love letters under her sacred robes, or the baker's wife whose labor was carved into stone. Rebellion isn't about perfection, it's about persistence, and sometimes the bravest act isn't storming the gates, but simply refusing to look away. If these stories ignited something in you, don't let that spark fade. Subscribe now, because history's hidden rebels have so much more to teach us, and their lessons are more urgent than ever. Who knows, the next act of defiance might just be yours.